Hello and welcome to today's Art with Mrs. Magano. Today I'm going to show you how to use the color crayon watercolors, or watercolor crayons as they're called. For today's lesson you'll need a box of the watercolor crayons, some watercolor paper, a pencil, a paintbrush for watercolor preferred, a paper towel folded up into fourths, and some water. When we are using watercolor crayons, we have to remember they're not like regular crayons. They don't feel the same when you're using them. They do feel kind of gritty when you're using it. They're not smooth. Crayons are wax-based, so they are smooth, and watercolor crayons are not wax-based, but they have pigment in them, so they're gonna act differently. When we are opening up our box of watercolor crayons, we need to make sure we can see the flowers or the top of the box, because if we have it upside down, they're all going to fall out the second that we open them. This video is not for students. This video is for teachers. So this is a way for you to learn some techniques and some different mediums to use with your students. So again, this is for teachers. So teach the kids how to slide it out. Make sure they can see the colors on the top. Otherwise, if they open it up the other way, they would all dump out. If they're broken, teach them that it's okay. You can still use them. It doesn't matter. And if the wrapping is off, that's okay too. They'll still be fine. Unlike oil pastels, these will not get on your fingers the way oil pastels do. Teach the students that to get one out, you push on one end and it pops up. So let me see if I can show you that from the side. You push on one end and they pop up, and then you can take it out. This medium is great for the younger students. I really like using this with the younger students. And then with the older students, I teach them how to make different colors. So we're going to do a little bit of both today. First off, let's draw something, shall we? I haven't planned, so let's say we're going to work on a three-dimensional shape. So we draw our line. So we have a three-dimensional box because that's just something super fast and quick to make. All right, so there's our three-dimensional box. And then let's see, maybe we're going to draw a tree over here. And then we'll leave this area open. So we don't need our, I don't know why I grabbed this. We don't need our watercolor brush right away. Let's start with our box. So I'm going to take out my orange watercolor crayon, and depending on how much pressure you put on the paper is how much pigment you're going to get onto the paper. So what I like to teach the students to do is to draw an outline of the whatever it is that you have drawn an outline. So that's the paint. If you ever had a paint by water book when you were a kid, this is the same kind of idea. And let's say we're teaching, let's do this just like I did. If you've seen the watercolor video, we did the same kind of idea. So let's say that the light is shining this way. So this wall that we can't see of the three-dimensional object is going to be the brightest, and this will be like a medium brightness. So let's leave that like that, and we're going to do an outline on the top that will be really bright, and then away from it, this would be the darkest. So we want to add, maybe I'll fill it in all the way. And then because that's the lightest, let's add another layer in between. And if you want, you could have them color it very lightly, either one. All right. Let's go and dip our paintbrush. We're going to wake it up. So we need to wake it up by pushing it down and getting all those bubbles out. Oh, the bubbles are so tiny today. Yesterday they were a lot bigger. And teach the kids to let some of that water drip out, put it on their paper towel. Start with your lightest, okay? Start with your lightest. So this would be the lightest, and we're just going to paint all that pigment that we put in there and pull it with the water into that middle space. We don't want it to be very dark. This should be the lightest. And then once they do that, have them dip their paintbrush back onto that wet spot maybe, or even off to the side, and then put their paintbrush in the water, because what that'll do is less pigment is going to go into that water and you're going to have clean water longer. Next, we're going to do the next darkest. So we're going to go around the edge here. Only one dip. They shouldn't need to dip in water more than once. And then they're going to pull that color into the center, so they get a nice rich shade of orange. And then they can dip or get their paintbrush dried off, add some more water. And this is our final, this should be the darkest. This should have the most value to it. And you know, if you find that this is not the darkest, which it kind of looks like that's the case on mine, if it looks like this is not the darkest, you can have the students use their paper towel to blot this middle one to make it a little more lighter. It even gives it a little bit of texture, so that you can see the difference between this shade and this shade of yellow. Once this dries, it looks really nice when you go over it with a Sharpie. Ultra fine tip Sharpies are really nice for tiny line work. I don't recommend it for younger students, because if you look at the tip of the fine point Sharpie, it's very tiny. And I know the younger students like to push really hard on their markers. So the ultra fine I would leave for the older students. All right, so if we're doing something like a tree, we're drawing something like a tree and we're going to paint that. Here's how I like to do this. So let's start with brown, and we're going to outline, like before, we're going to outline our bark. You can even put some here. And this is what's really, this is like my favorite. You can use these to draw the lines that maybe would be on the object. So I like to draw some wiggly lines coming down, because they will show up. If you're doing this light enough, they will show up. They'll add the pigment to the bark, but they'll also leave those lines in, and it'll look really nice. And then for the leaves of the tree, I like to go around all these lines. Yeah, these crayons are definitely different than regular crayons. And then inside, this is where you can maybe draw some other little shapes of leaves, because that's going to add more pigment to your tree. I try and encourage the kids to use a lot of water when using the watercolor crayons, because you don't need as much pigment as you do when you're dipping into the watercolor palettes that have the pigment ready to add water to it. So I go down and I just start dragging all that paint around, and it looks so nice. Oh, I just love these. These are so fun to play with. And look at those lines, stay there and give it more realistic look. Now, if you want to teach them to add a little bit of shading, you can have them bring more of that paint from one side over. So like this is underneath the tree, you could have them paint that a little bit more. And they don't need a whole lot of water. Like this is all just one dip, and I can paint for quite a while. So I paint on one side, and it gives that tree a little more three-dimensional look to it. Make sure they dry off their brush, dip it in the water, dry it off. Now we're going to go for our green. Here's what's really fun, actually. Let's say we're not just going to use green. If we want to change the color of what we have, we can maybe go over the top of some of those other green leaves with yellow, or even orange if you're learning about the fall, and then start painting. So again, I like to go around the edges to get the pigment that's there. A lot of kids want their paint to look dark. And what's different about watercolor than other paints is that it's supposed to be light and then you darken it as you go. So it takes a lot of restraint when we're working with watercolors, whether that be liquid watercolors, watercolor crayons, watercolor pencils. It's always a good idea to teach them, leave some of these white spaces in here. That makes it look more realistic. You'll have a lot more depth to your painting. And I know kids just want to make it dark. Like this probably wouldn't be dark enough for some kids, but if you teach them these steps first, then they can get into adding more layers along the way. So now I'm going to dip it a little bit more and go over these yellow parts that have a little bit of that lighter green. And they can even pull that color to other colors. Oop, there's a little hair on there. And now we have some really pretty colors happening just by adding one other color to the tree. All right, so that was on dry paper. This is fun. So we have some area over here that we can use, so we can do some dry on wet, which is gonna sound so strange, but go ahead and get a big section. You could even, if you're not sure where you want to paint, you could even have just block off a big section of your paper and have the kids maybe do the same thing and tell them to just put some water into that shape. And then you have to look around. You have to move your head back and forth. Like I can't tell where I've painted and where I haven't. So make sure that they really move their head around so they can see. And then let that sit for a minute. Let that water soak into that section. And then this is backwards, right? So we had dry paper, which we put dry paint on, and then we wet it. This is wet paper with dry paint. So let's play around with some colors. I'm going to add some blue, and you'll find that it's going to start immediately bleeding out. It's really pretty. It's fun to watch. And then maybe we want some dark blue. And it runs so much smoother. You can see the water on the edge of it where it's not dry, it's getting wet. But look at those vibrant colors coming through. Maybe a little purple. Maybe some green. And it just feels different. It just feels so different to use the crayons in this way. And you can see the colors are already meshing together. Let me autofocus. There we go. We can see some of those colors blending together. And then if it's not happening enough, then you can have the kids go over it with more water. And they can see how they have made these new colors with their watercolor crayons. It's a lot of fun to play with the colors. Sometimes it's fun just to give them a day where you teach them these techniques and then have them play with it. Maybe they want to mix that yellow and that red to make a new color. These are great for landscape art. All right, so that is how to use the watercolor crayons, and I hope you are able to take some of these techniques back to your classroom. Thanks for watching.